Welcome to Ars Libri, an everyman's journey through Western literature, where we explore the literary arts book by book, reading, retelling, and reclaiming our rich heritage. Thank you for subscribing. If you're enjoying this content, please tell your friends about Ars Libri and share some of the free episodes with them. This is a speech that Tolkien gave, J.R.R. Tolkien. It's called On Fairy Stories. He wrote a longer essay, 41 pages long, and then he gave a speech, 15 pages long. I'm going to read the shorter essay, the shorter speech, but also go over some things I highlighted in the essay that's really long. Tolkien gives his explanation for how he creates fairy stories, what fairy stories are, who should read them, what they're not, and a lot of misunderstandings. He also talks about some of the development of fairy stories, which align a lot with the theory that I've come up with on my own, which is that all literature used to be written for adults. All education was to make you mature until around the 1800s, when we as a culture in the West, we as a society in the West, began not to dumb it down so much, although that did happen. We began to relegate all of this to children. And so children aren't going to read Herodotus anymore. They're going to read a children's Herodotus. And then that turns into, let's just read a story about a child who bumbled his way through the war. And you're not actually reading Herodotus anymore. You're reading a 100-page story about a little child who was on the journey with Augustine. You're not even reading Augustine anymore. And then that eventually turned into, let's just read about our own little made-up stories about duckling crossing the road and nice thing. It turned into really, really, really dumbing it down. Well, Tolkien has a way of explaining that in this essay or in this speech. He talks about many other things, though. We'll get into it. That's my pet theory. I'll try not to harp on it very much. He gave this speech in 1938 at St. Andrews as part of the Andrew Lang lectures, and he's going to bring up Andrew Lang many times. Andrew Lang was one of the first guys, kind of like the Brothers Grimm or others that compiled fairy stories. Andrew Lang did that as well. This is the introduction to his speech. He says, "I propose to speak about fairy stories, though I am aware that this is a rash adventure. Faerie, F-A-E-R-I-E, is a perilous land, and in it are pitfalls for the unwary and dungeons for the overbold. And overbold I may be accounted, for though I have been a lover of fairy stories since I learned to read, and have at times thought about them, I have not studied them professionally." This is interesting because people think Tolkien is a professional fairy tale story writer. He's actually not. At least he didn't consider himself so. In 1938, he was a philologist, which is someone who studies language and the development of language. And it was through that he bumped into all of these stories of old, because you learn language through stories and writings of old. And he began to learn this. He's not a proper literary scholar, and he admits it, but he just ended up writing it anyway. And same thing with C.S. Lewis. He wasn't a literary specialist. He actually was a medieval scholar. And just through studying medieval literature, he became a writer of fiction. And that's something really important, I think, because people think, oh, I'm going to become a writer. Like, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to set out to do that. Some of the best writers in the world, in fact, almost all writers in the world that have been truly greats. Who was Alexandre Dumas? Who was he? Did he write hundreds of novels and then 2 of them stuck? 2 of them were great? 3 of them were great? Or you have some people who wrote, it's like the one-hit wonder band. They played no other songs before and none after. They made one and it was the greatest ever. Almost all literature in history, it's written by people who they tried their hand at it once or twice and went on with the rest of their lives. And it was great. Well, how did these guys do it? And how did many people do it? They studied other things. And then literature came from that.
Yeah, I think studying language is a really interesting way to get into storytelling. I think it shows the power of language and its place in developing culture and a people. You know, how that would translate into storytelling. Like that's a really neat connection.
Yeah, of course. Tolkien says, I have been hardly more than a wandering explorer or trespasser in the land of Fairy, full of wonder, but not of information. The realm of fairy story is wide and deep, and high, and filled with many things. All manner of beasts and birds are found there, shoreless seas and stars uncounted, beauty that is an enchantment, and an ever-present peril, both joy and sorrow as sharp as swords. In that realm a man may, perhaps, count himself fortunate to have wandered, but its richness and strangeness tie the tongue of a traveler who would report them. And while he is there, it is dangerous for him to ask too many questions, lest the gates be shut and the keys be lost. For Tolkien, the fairy world is a place that you travel in your imagination. You really travel there. You don't start writing a story, for instance, and just kind of bumble your way through. You have to, in your imagination, create a world and enter into it in your imagination. And as you're walking around, you try to report things as best as you can. And that's how he wrote his Lord of the Rings, or the whole Middle-earth epic. It's as though he had gone to this place or had talked to people who went there. It's like he's Plutarch, who's writing about the past and says, well, this guy says this and this guy says that, and I went and saw this, actually, except he was actually there in his mind. It also reminds me of Psyche and Cupid. She can live with Cupid so long as she doesn't see him and try to reveal him and investigate him scientifically. The moment you try to remove imagination, the moment you try to see things as they really are, it's gone. The gates are shut and locked forever. She's out. Tolkien says, there are, however, some questions that one who is to speak about fairy stories must expect to answer or attempt to answer, whatever the folk of Fairy may think of his impertinence. For instance, what are fairy stories? What is their origin? What is the use of them? I'll try to give answer to these questions, or such hints of answers to them as I have gleaned, primarily from the stories themselves, the few of all their multitude that I know. The few of all their multitude. Tolkien's saying he only knew a few. And he spent his life studying this, and he doesn't even call himself a specialist. There's so many. He also says that he will give hints to answers. I have the option now of reading this speech or of going through my notes, and I think I'm going to try to go through my notes of his essay, which is more detailed than the speech. So instead of reading the speech, I'm going to go through my highlights of the essay, which I think to me are more in depth. Tolkien says in a section of his speech, the next section is called Fairy Story. After that, the section is Origins, and then Children. And then he gets into other sections called Fantasy and other things, which we may do another episode on just because it's so long. But the first section of his speech is called Fairy Story. Tolkien says, what is a fairy story? In this case, you will turn to the Oxford English Dictionary in vain. It contains no reference to the combination fairy story and is unhelpful on the subject of fairies generally. Fairy story is recorded since the year 1750, and its leading sense is said to be a tale about fairies, or generally a fairy legend with developed senses, or an incredible or unreal story, or a falsehood. That's what a fairy story is. Tolkien says this makes fairy stories way too broad. Way too broad. Two elements of fairy stories that he talks about are the supernatural and the diminutive small size of the fairies. He says, it is man who, in contrast to fairies, is supernatural and often of diminutive stature, whereas they, the fairies, are natural, far more natural than he. Thank you for joining us on this special free snippet of our bonus episode on Tolkien's speech on fairy stories. To hear the full episode, including exclusive bonus content, become a supporter of the show. By subscribing at arslibri.substack.com, you'll unlock all our extended episodes, bonus discussions, and more. Your support keeps this podcast thriving and lets us dig deeper into the world of literature. Visit arslibri.substack.com and join today. Let's keep the enchantment alive.